if you into this kink and BDSM ish, you got to be traumatized, right? Right? Let's talk about all of the things. Hey, it's Linda Renee, aka Doc Yu Roc, and welcome back to the channel where we dive into all things kink healing and authenticity. Today, we're tackling a topic that often comes up in conversations about kink and the BDSM community: trauma. You got to be traumatized, right? Specifically, we're going to look at the claim that people in the kink community are more likely to have experienced trauma. Let me give y'all a spoiler alert. Just going to tell y'all right now. The research says that ain't true, but we're going to take a closer look, more nuanced look. Y'all ready? Coffee. Let's get it. Grab your drink of choice. All right, so let's start with the research. There's this pervasive myth that people in the kink and BDSM community are more likely to have experienced trauma or abuse than the general population. But studies, including research published in journals like the Journal of Sex Research, the Journal of Sex Research, and the Archives of Sexual Behavior, tell a different story. These studies have consistently shown that being into BDSM is not linked to higher rates of trauma or psychopathology. And we ain't all fucked up and crazy, or are we? Now, let's talk about it. In fact, BDSM practitioners often score higher on measures of openness and lower on neuroticism compared to the general population. How about that? So, what does all of this mean? It means we're not a community full of damaged people. We're a community full of folks who are curious, adventurous, and often more emotionally regulated than these other folks. That said, the conversation doesn't end there because while the research tells us one thing, we can't ignore the lived experiences of the many people in the kink and BDSM community. And here's where the nuance comes in. Y'all know I love me some nuance, all right? The kink BDSM community is home to a lot of people from marginalized communities. We're talking about folks who are queer, trans, neurodivergent, poly, people of color, and so many other whose identities exist outside of mainstream norms. Unfortunately, people from marginalized communities are more likely to have experienced some form of trauma. Not because they're kinky, but because people are real fucked up. Because of systemic oppression, discrimination, and violence. The reality is, when you're marginalized, you're often searching for some belonging and some safety and some acceptance in ways that the dominant culture just doesn't provide us. Think about it. Queer and trans folks face disproportionately high rates of bullying, family rejection, and hate crimes. Black and brown communities endure systemic racism and violence. Neurodiverse individuals often face mistreatment, misunderstanding, and isolation. When you belong to one or more of these communities, the likelihood of encountering trauma increases, not because of who you are, but because of how society treats you. So when we look at the kink community and notice a higher concentration of people who've experienced trauma, it's not because being kinky attracts traumatized people. It's because people from marginalized groups who already face disproportionate harm and trauma often find belonging here, right? When you create a space where marginalized folks can feel safe, validated, and seen, you're naturally going to see a higher representation of those folks who've been mistreated elsewhere. It's not the kink. It's the culture around the identities of the people who are drawn to the community. I'm gonna let that sink in for a little bit while I take a sip. Does that make sense? Y'all let me know in the comments. So here's the beautiful thing about kink. It is a space where many of us find healing, acceptance, and some agency. It's a community built on consent, communication, and authenticity. Values that resonate deeply with people who've experienced harm or rejection elsewhere. But well, we got to keep it a stack, right? We got to keep it a stack. The kink BDSM community is not perfect at all. Abuse can happen within the community, right? Just because we emphasize consent and risk awareness doesn't mean that everyone follows those principles. We got some fuck ups in the community, all right? There are people who misuse kink dynamics or intentionally violate trust. And we need to acknowledge that. This is why education, accountability, and vetting are so important. Being part of this community means upholding its best practices and calling out the BS when we see it. It's about creating a culture of care, not perfection, because it doesn't exist. But we can strive to be better day and day, right? Right. Let me take a sip on that. So this is where therapeutic BDSM can come in. That's the approach that I've developed. And it was developed to integrate elements of kink into the healing work. Therapeutic BDSM isn't therapy, as I've said multiple times. It's an intentional intervention that involves kink knowledgeable clinicians working alongside vetted practitioners to create safe, consensual scenes designed to help clients process trauma, explore identity, and reclaim their power. It bridges the gap between the power of kink and the intentionality of trauma informed care, providing a framework where safety and consent are paramount. Now, here's how the kink and the BDSM community support people in their journeys: consent and communication. In BDSM, everything starts with mutual agreement, or it should, right? For folks who've experienced trauma, having the power to negotiate boundaries can be incredibly healing. Then we have safe exploration. Kink provides a structured, consensual way to explore themes of power, vulnerability, and control. Things that might feel unresolved for some people, especially if you've had your control and your power taken away from you. Then we have community support. Many people find acceptance in a kink community that they don't experience anywhere else. There's something powerful about being seen and celebrated for who you are, whether or not you're tall, short, fat, black, old, whatever, right? In most cases, they are welcomed in the kink community and even times celebrated. Hmm. So let's go ahead and like knock this myth about the park, right? Myth is some bull. Let's also hold space for the complexity of what it means to be part of a marginalized community in a world that doesn't always treat us kindly. The kink and BDSM community, the kink and BDSM community isn't about broken folk. It's not about broken people. It's about brave people. People who've decided to embrace who they are, find connection, and build a world that feels good, safe, and affirming. And for those of us working on trauma, tools like therapeutic BDSM provide an intentional, collaborative approach to reclaiming agency and rewriting our stories. That said, let's also remember that ain't no community perfect. The kink BDSM community does have flaws, and it's on all of us to stay educated, accountable, and committed to creating a culture of consent and care, especially a community that is a space for so many marginalized folks who happen to have a history of trauma because not because we're into kink and not because we damaged, but because the society we live in is. Now, now, what are y'all thoughts? Because this is it for me for today. But the reason this topic came up is because I was having a conversation with someone and we were discussing that the research does not support this idea that people who are in the kink and BDSM communities are more traumatized. However, we both discussed that we've noticed that the community does have a concentration of people with a history of trauma. But it's not because they're into kink, it's because their identities have not been accepted. And because they have not been accepted, they've been abused, right? And so I felt like this was a needed and necessary conversation to kind of tease that apart so that we're making sure that we are showing up and meeting the needs of the people in the space. So with that, my loves, I love y'all so much. Y'all go ahead and do all of the things, subscribe, like, share, all of that good stuff. And let me know what y'all think and what else y'all want to talk about. Because in the meantime, this is Doc Yu Roc, and I'm out. Peace. Bye for now.